Our first guest is Louise Sheiner. She is a Robert S. Kerr Senior Fellow in Economic Studies and Policy Director for the Hutchins Center on Fiscal and Monetary Policy at the Brookings Institution. She served as an economist with the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System and as a senior economist in the fiscal analysis section for the Research and Statistics Division there. I've asked her to come talk about some new research that she and her colleagues did about the status and the current status and the status going forward of state pensions. This is really innovative, in-depth, unique research that Brookings did, and so she's going to talk about that, and then she'll have time for questions. It's 11:10 right now. We have her until 11:50, or since I've been jabbering here for a few extra minutes, we'll go to 11:55 to get enough questions in. But with that, I will turn it over to Louise.
So yeah, thank you very much for having me. I'm going to share my screen in a second. I want this to be a casual conversation to the extent possible. If you have questions or experiences from your state that you want to share, that would be great. So I'm going to talk about the sustainability of state and local government pensions. We call it a public finance approach. I'll tell you why as I go through the slides. This is based on work by colleagues Jamie Lenny, Byron Lutz, Finn Shula. I'm going to give you the disclaimers even though they're not here. So Jamie works at the Bank of England and Byron works at the Fed. And for both of them, this is our opinion and not representing those of the Bank of England or the Board of Governors. Okay, so what our paper did was ask the following pretty basic questions. Are state and local pension plans fiscally sustainable, meaning that they are likely to be able to pay their benefits without changes to employer contributions or cuts to benefits, right? So if nothing changes, will they be able to keep on paying benefits? If not, what do they need to do to be sustainable and how quickly do they need to act? Okay, I'm going to give you a whole bunch of background slides. So as you probably know, most state and local employees do have defined benefit pension plans. Most private sector workers do not. What's a defined benefit pension plan? It's kind of like Social Security. You work a certain number of years. When you retire, you get a pension benefit until you die. That's going to be based on how many years you worked and what your wages were, right? Most private sector workers now have defined contribution plans, which is like the employer puts money in at the front, and then whatever it grows to over time is what you've got. Defined benefit guarantees a certain benefit in the future, which is why you worry about whether or not the plans are going to actually be able to make that payment, right? State and local government pensions are really important economic institutions. They have almost $5 trillion in assets, and they cover about 10 million retirees. And about a quarter of those retirees don't have Social Security. They only have their pension from their state. So it's an alternative for about a quarter of plans. So that's particularly important economic institution for them. There has been a ton of discussion of the fact that the plans are unfunded or underfunded, right? What does that even mean? How do you know how funded a plan is? So what is fundedness? It's the ratio of the assets to the liabilities, right? So how much do they have to pay out in the future and how much will they have? So that you know what the value of the assets is. It's like, what do I have in the bank? It's the stocks, the bonds, everything. You can just, you know what it is. It's the market value of their holdings. You don't know liabilities. Liabilities is based on some estimate of what the wage growth is going to be and when people will retire and how long they will live. And so to calculate fundedness, actuaries project these benefits based on the pension rules and assumptions about productivity growth and demographics and wage growth and retirement probabilities, all those things that go into it. And then they calculate what economists call a present value by discounting the stream of benefits to today, right? And the question, basically you're saying, if I have to pay out all this much money, what is the value of that in today's dollars, right? So one of the big controversies is what rate of return to use to discount those assets, to discount the liabilities, right? So I'm going to say, if I owe you $100 next year, what's it in present value today? It's going to be 100 divided by 1 plus the interest rate. And then the question is, what interest rate? The actuaries say, well, I'm going to use what I think I'm going to make on my stocks and bonds to discount the liabilities. The big argument in academia about these plans have been about that rate. The finance economists say that's the wrong rate. these plans are basically guaranteed. We'll talk a little bit about that, but basically they're guaranteed. And in certain states, they are completely guaranteed. You cannot change them. So if someone's worked and is owed some benefit based on what they've worked, it is a promise to that person to pay that the state can't get out of, or the plan can't get out of. And so because governments have to pay these benefits, they say that's a riskless that's a riskless benefit. It can't change. And so you should discount at the risk-free rate. The risk-free rate is much, much lower. So using risk-free rates, Josh Rao, who's really been kind of on the forefront of this, has said the unfunded liabilities were like 4 trillion and plans were only funded. That was in 2017. When we use today's much lower interest rates, much lower treasury rates, which is what people think of as the risk-free rate, plans are even less funded, just 35% funded, meaning if you look at what they owe versus what they have, they only have about a third of it, all right? And this fact that these plans are really underfunded, especially when you discount at these appropriate rates, has led to just totally widespread concern about this is a crisis, the plans can't pay their benefits. That's come from academics, the press, rating agencies, policymakers are always talking about the crisis in pension plans. Josh Rao and Novi Mark said, because they're unfunded, they have failed to provide economic security in old age in a financially stable way. So they've made these promises to the retirees and they cannot fund it, so they're not gonna be able to keep them. That's how the press has reported it. We just had like a Google search or Factiva search about the word state and local pension and crisis. And you can see it went up a lot. It's come down. This ended in 2018. We haven't updated it, but clearly it was very much in the news. And then of course, COVID came around, but that's how it's been perceived and still is, I think. So, and one of the consequences of it is pension plans have actually been sharply increasing funding over time. So if you look at this is relative to 1998, we're comparing the red dotted line is spending on structures, because we have data on that sort of construction spending, road spending, buildings. The dotted blue line is spending on wages and salaries. And the black line is spending on pensions. So if you look at it relative to 1998 as a share of tax receipts, the only thing that's gone up is pensions. So you get the sense that maybe pension funds are crowding out every other priority, right? So they can't spend money on roads and they can't spend money on maybe getting the lead out of water or on hiring more teachers because they feel this need to just keep putting more money in their pensions. So the real sort of point of our paper is that this discussion kind of leaps from the fact that plans are unfunded to that plans can't pay their benefits. They sort of assume that plans must be fully funded in order to pay benefits, and that is actually not true, right? Plans can be sustainable in the sense that benefits are payable for the foreseeable future without changing contributions, while pension contributions are stable without being fully funded. And one example to think about is Social Security. Social Security has basically always been an unfunded program. They have some assets, but they're very small. And it's a pay-as-you-go program. The money coming in is used to pay the money going out. They don't have any stocks and bonds, or not very many, but they have money coming in every year and they just pay it out. Now, some people say, well, that's a Ponzi scheme, but a government can do that. As long as the money coming in is good enough to pay the benefit, it's fine. So as long as the taxes are at least as large as the benefits, you're fine. Now we do have an issue with Social Security. The benefits are rising faster than the taxes because of population aging. So the growth rate of the workforce isn't as big as the growth rate of the elderly population. And so there's going to have to be made some adjustments. But nobody's talking about making the kind of adjustments that would be necessary in order for Social Security to be fully funded. Those would be massive. They're just talking about small changes in payroll taxes or cuts in benefits to equilibrate, again, those taxes and benefits, and not starting to be funded. It would still just be a pay-go system. You just have to adjust. And that's kind of what we're all talking about. Imagine you just thought about making those kinds of adjustments, right?
Louise, I have one question. Question in chat here from Stephen Caruso. Who are the kinds of people who don't have Social Security but have a state or local pension?
So I think it's mostly older state and local workers. I think for new hires, they're mostly in Social Security, but I'm not 100% sure of that. I think it's just some plans. In fact, actually, I know that's not true. My daughter's about to be a resident in Ohio, and she will not be, the contributions will just be into her plan. So it's some states, and I don't actually know a lot about which states have decided and when. when Social Security first started, there were these state plans, and so they were just parallel. There's a lot of talk actually about making states part of the Social Security system, because I think one of the things that happens is people work for a while for the state, and then they work for Social Security, and in some sense, people think that there may be double dipping. But I don't know a ton about that. You can look it up. At the last slide, I give you some resources to look up some of these things. And there's a place called the Boston Center for Retirement Research that has like lots of little 2-3 pages on all these kinds of issues. They're all about state and local pensions. So it's some states and some workers, and many teachers, I think. Okay, so let's think about what not being fully funded means. Another way of just thinking about it is, it just means state and local governments have implicit debt, right? And so one way to think about it is, a less than fully funded plan is like a fully funded plan and implicit debt. And you could actually think about making the implicit debt explicit debt. So imagine that state and local governments just borrowed the amount that they needed to make the plan fully funded, right? So the plan has 35% of their liabilities. They borrow 65%. The plan's now fully funded and they have debt. What does that mean? It means that they can use the money from the plan to pay benefits, and then they also have to use the money to pay the interest cost on the debt. That's basically what we're doing. We're saying it's like having explicit debt, and we're kind of treating it that way. And once you see it that way, you're like, okay, well, governments have debt. That's not unusual, and it's not a big deal. And so this idea that not being fully funded means that you're in a crisis doesn't really follow. It means state and local governments actually have a bit more debt than we thought they did, or maybe a lot more debt than we thought they did. But governments can have debt, and they don't ever have to pay off the debt. They just have to make the interest payments. They can just keep rolling it over. That's what's different between a government and like a household. When they borrow, have to pay off the debt. But the federal debt is just constantly rolled over. State and local debts can be constantly rolled over. And that's why it's not necessarily a crisis to have debt. It just means you have these payments that you have to make on the debt. Okay. What does going to full funding mean? So if you were not fully funded and then you went to full funding, it's saying like, I have debt and I'm going to fully pay it off, right? And one of the things that we think is really important to note is that this implicit pension debt is not new, right? Even using the actuaries' assumed rates of return, plans have almost never been fully funded. Using the riskless rates of return that finance economists suggest should be used, they've never been fully funded, not never. So in some sense, current taxpayers have just inherited the debt. And if you decided to say, oh, we really should be fully funded, that would be like making current taxpayers pay a lot to help future taxpayers, right? So it would say, well, we have this big debt, let's put it all on the next 30 years of taxpayers to help the future taxpayers pay less. Since they've all inherited a debt, a more sort of natural way to think about spreading the costs of the debt is to just say, well, let's all share the debt, right? We're going to spread it over our generation and the next generations. And the way you do that is you say, just make sure the debt is constant as a share of GDP, right? So each generation is going to pay enough interest on the debt to keep it from rising as a share of GDP. That's basically what our analysis does. It says, imagine that's what you want. You want to spread the costs over the debt over time. What do you need to do? Okay. So as I said before, what we do is to say, look, we know they've effectively long been partially funded. So we want to see, well, we said being partially funded doesn't mean you necessarily can't be sustainable. It doesn't necessarily mean you can't pay your benefits. So let's test to see if you can. If you can't, when are the plans likely to run out of money? Is it next year, 5 years, 20 years? That sort of tells you how urgent the problem is and what changes are required to make them sustainable, okay? And I think more broadly, why we call it a public finance approach is we're making this sort of recognizing it's just government debt. We're not treating it as something special, as, oh, something different about pension. It's just like part of the government portfolio. They've got assets, they've got obligations, they've got Medicaid in the future, they've got tax revenues in the future. We're just putting it in the mix and looking at sort of government, like pension obligations, just like other government spending. For the federal government, you've all seen, I'm sure, the Congressional Budget Office projections annual cash flows estimates for revenues and for spending. And we're going to do the same thing for the state and local pensions. Okay. As a preview on our conclusions, under low and moderate asset returns, which I'll talk to you about in a second, they're actually not currently sustainable. At higher rates of return, they are, mostly, not every plan, but most plans. Plans can be stabilized, especially at this moderate asset return, with what we think are moderate fiscal adjustments, much lower than what would be required to be fully funded. And there's not really a huge rush. There's only modest returns to stabilizing immediately versus in the future. And in some cases, which I'll show you, you actually want to wait. And of course, there's a lot of heterogeneity across the plans, and some plans are far from stable. Okay, what do we do? I'm going to go quickly because we're not going to have a lot of time. We basically do this analysis by going into incredible detail into these actuarial reports about what each plan's rules are and what the rules are for existing employees and for new hires and what the COLA rules are. There's a whole bunch of stuff, and we do these projections and we compare them what do the actuaries do to make sure that we're doing a good job. And so we only have 40 plans because it's very labor intensive to do what we do, but we chose the 40 plans so that they matched the aggregates. So we compare our sample to the national sample in this public plans database, which is from that Boston Retirement Center I told you about. We match it on all kinds of things. So we feel pretty good that when we put our plans together, that's basically telling you what the national aggregates are. Okay. Okay. Oh, and then what we do, which nobody else does, is we want to look at these things on an ongoing basis. So we're saying, well, we have a bunch of current hire employees. We know who they are, but we also know that there'll be new hires going forward. So we say, assume that employment in the state and local sector matches employment in the state, which is going to be matching employment growth, population growth in the state, which we have state by state. And then we sort of just simulate by adding new hires. And so we keep these pension plans going in perpetuity. So this is what it looks like. And the first thing we wanted to see was, like, is this like Social Security? We know there's a demographic transition in Social Security that's going to make plans harder, right? Put Social Security out of whack. Is that what's going on in state and local? And so this is the ratio of beneficiaries in these state and local plans to the workforce in the plans. And you can see this ratio of beneficiaries to workforce increases quite a bit, about 30%, 6% over the next decades. It looks very similar to what we expect for Social Security. So we have that same demographic transition happening, which we expected in these pension plans as in Social Security and in society as large. As the population is aging, they're not hiring as many people, and therefore the ratio of beneficiaries to workers is increasing. But what was really surprising to us is that we looked at the ratio of not the people, but the benefits that they're getting. And that isn't rising the way Social Security is rising. Our benefits only rise 5% over the next 2 decades, and then they decline. Social Security rises about 28% and doesn't decline, and then kind of starts to crawl up over time. So this means that plans are going to eventually get fiscal relief. The benefits are going down over time. And that says governments may want to smooth through them. If I know there's a big surge in benefits for a while, but then it goes down, I'm going to not want to like raise contributions that much. I'm going to say, well, let's sort of use our assets for a while to stabilize or even borrow. Okay. So why is this? What like this really surprised us, this picture. And so what we basically did is sort of try to figure out what things could be going on. And we explained most of it, not all of it, but most of it. So the way we explained it to say, look, Social Security pays cost of living increases to beneficiaries. A lot of pension plans don't. And in fact, in the last 10 years, a lot of pension plans have changed their COLAs. And so one of the things that people have recognized in some states, even though you can't change the benefit formula for existing hires, you have to pay them this benefit. You don't have to pay them the COLA. You actually can change the COLA for existing employees, even existing retirees. You can say, this year we're not doing a COLA. And so a lot of plans don't have a COLA or only have like half of the CPI increase or 1% a year, all kinds of different rules. And then on top of that, plans have made very, very large changes to benefits for new hires. So they can't change the benefit rules for the existing workers, but they can for new hires, and they've done that a lot. So we said, imagine that they had none of these new hire reforms starting from, today on. And then the COLA was equal to inflation, right? So imagine that everybody who's now a worker gets the same benefits as the ones who have the most generous benefits who are still working, and the COLA is inflation. And if you do that, you kind of match the Social Security. It's not quite as large, but it's much, much larger. And you see, because lack of COLAs make sort of they're compounded over time, and the new hire reforms take a long time to really show up. You can see that you get these massive differences in the long run. Instead of going up over time, it goes down from like 1.65% of GDP to like 1.45. So this is the explanation that we've come up with. And this really means you have to think about this quite differently than Social Security. Okay, I'm going to run out of time. So I'm going to quickly tell you what our sustainability analysis is. We're saying we're doing something very similar like we do for the federal budget. So plans are putting in a certain amount of payroll right now. Actually, in 2017, when this was all based from, they're putting a certain percent of payroll into their plans. Imagine they just do that every year, right? So they don't change their contributions, and we just analyze the cash flows going forward. How much is coming in? How much is going out? And what happens to their assets? Are they going to run out of assets? And be on this ever path of sort of going more negative and more negative. To do that, we have to have an assumption about the rate of return on assets. That's a really, really complicated, controversial question. Should you do this sustainability analysis with assuming that assets get this risk-free rate of return? So imagine they put all their money in treasuries, because no, they don't do that. But when they put their money in stocks, it's really risky. And so you shouldn't count the higher return. You shouldn't count on it. And so you can count on the treasury rate of return. So let's do that. There's a whole bunch of arguments about why you would or wouldn't want to do that beyond the scope of the paper. So we do three things. We say we're going to use the risk-free rate of return, which is the treasury. We think that's really low and probably too low, especially because the rate of return right now is extremely low. It's basically 0% real. So inflation adjusted, it's like you get no return on your assets. And that's not something that we think is going to persist. And we also think it's not all about risk, but we do it. We do the 5% return, much, much higher, which is kind of what the actuaries assume. And it's about what plans have received since 2000, right? So this is kind of the expected rate of return. And then we do something in between, which is really just halfway in between to say, well, you can make arguments that 0 is too low and 5 is too high. Maybe something in between is kind of a reasonable. And it's, again, beyond, and don't worry about the CBO. We also did the CBO rate of return, but let's just think about the three. Okay, so this is looking at assets to GDP. And so if you are spending out way more than you have, you're going to be depleting your assets. If you're not, your assets are going to be increasing. So if you take this expected rate of return at 5%, plans in the aggregate are just fine, actually. They're not going to exhaust their assets. In fact, they're doing too much, right? Which makes sense, because what plans actually do is to say, I want to get fully funded in 30 years, and I'm going to put in enough to do that. And they assume this kind of 5% rate of return. And so that means that they're actually planning on building up their assets. And if they keep doing that, even after they're fully funded, they're just going to keep increasing forever. If you take these lower rates of return, then you do run out of assets. At 0, you run out of assets in about 30 years in the aggregate, and at 2.5, about 45 years. So it's not as if an aggregate plans are exhausting their assets really soon. Some plans are. One plan, in fact, New Jersey is, but it's not as if they're stable at these lower rates of return. At the 5%, they're fine.
Let me ask you could go back to that one. Let me ask a dumb question here.
Yeah.
The brown line, the 0% real return, at the end ends up higher than the lines for the 2.5 or the CBO rates.
Yes.
How is that?
Okay, so I will get to that before, but I'll tell you about it now. So there's something kind of crazy about these 0% rates of return. If you've heard about this whole question about people saying, do we have to worry about the debt now that interest rates are so low? It really is the mirror of that. To keep assets constant as a share of GDP, assets have to grow with GDP, right? When rates of return are 0%, that's less than GDP growth. So if I have assets and they're not giving me any return, but my GDP is growing and I want my assets to grow, I have to take taxpayer money just to put in the assets, just to keep up with GDP. And so when your assets earn such a low rate of return, you are actually better off in this kind of sense being pay as you go. Assets are costly. They're not giving you anything. Like, you could use them up, so that's good, right? And they're good for risk protection because you can use them up. But if you want to actually like keep them at a level, I want to have my assets 20% of GDP, it's really hard to do when interest rates are this low. And that is the converse of the argument you hear at the federal level, which is debt is not costly when interest rates are this low, because even if you don't pay any interest, if the interest rates are 0 and GDP is growing, debt falls all by itself as a share of GDP. So this is all about that conversation of how long can interest rates be below the rate of growth of GDP, because it's kind of really turns everything you ever thought around in terms of sustainability. So I don't know if that explains it, but, and I think I have a little bit more on the slides after, but I didn't think I'd have time to really go through that, but that is really what's going on. So, and happy to talk more about it if anybody wants to, because it is sort of it's not just about pensions, it's just about in general, like it's not something you hear about the debt all the time. Okay.
Let me just pause for a second. We got a couple questions coming in on the rate of return expectations.
Yeah.
And I just want to keep ahead, keep watch on the clock. It's 11:37. We'll go to 11:55. So if we have a bunch of questions, let me know now. But if you can kind of maybe aim to be getting through the presentation, after this question in like 5 minutes or so.
I can do that.
Okay, so Laura from the Dayton Daily News asks, Ohio's 5 systems have assumed rates of return between 7 and 7.75, a long way from 5%. How much of a problem is that? That Ethan says they're doing the same in New Hampshire. Let
me just clarify. So our rates of return are inflation adjusted.
Okay.
So 5 is basically 7.
Got it.
Okay. 7.5, depending on what you think the inflation is going to be. This is a CPI 2.2, 2.3, so like 7.3. So that's why we say the 5 is kind of what places are doing. Okay. So we do these 2 exercises. One is to say, look, this is like long run stability says, imagine that you just stabilize your debt. I don't care what level, but do something now. I raise my contribution today and forevermore so that we will now be able to pay benefits in perpetuity, never have to touch anything again. The other way to say it is, well, I don't want to do such long run things because who knows what's going to happen in the long run. So let's just say whatever your debt to GDP ratio is today, and this is this implicit debt, sort of this unfunded liabilities relative to GDP. Let's say, make sure in 30 years it's no bigger. So that's a little bit more of a constrained exercise. And then we calculate what you have to do. So if you want to stabilize the implicit debt in the long run, you have to, at a 2.5% rate of return, raise contributions 8% of payroll. That's a little bit less than what they've done already in the past 10 years. It's not nothing, but it's not crisis level, okay? If you wait 30 years, you say, I don't do anything for 30 years. I totally ignore the problem. So I let my assets go down. I just do nothing. And then in 30 years, I'm saying, ooh, now I want to stabilize. Then you have to do a bit more, but not a lot more. Then you're going from 8 to 10. So you get 30 years of not doing anything, and you have to go to 10 in the long run. So this is our view that 1, it's not that huge. And 2, it's not so, if you have other priorities right now, fine, focus on those priorities, right? At 0, it's different, it's bigger, it's more like 15% today. But here's this thing coming up again. The longer you delay, the better off you are. And that's because the longer you delay, the lower your assets, and assets are costly when interest rates are below the growth rate of the economy. So it's this kind of counterintuitive thing that if you actually took 0 seriously, you would have to say, well, I don't even want assets. So you kind of have like, well, the interest rates are high, I'm okay. And if they're really low, I'm not okay, I have to do a lot, but I'm happy to wait. I don't actually think 0 is the right rate, but some people do. Like the finance economists who reviewed this say, oh, well, we're obviously going to choose 0. I don't. So, and like, as I said, we don't solve that problem in this paper. So if you do the second exercise and you say, well, I don't want to stabilize forever, I want to make sure we hit today's implicit debt ratio. If you start today, you have to do almost the same, not quite as much. If you wait, it's bigger. And that's because if you wait, you're going to get less funded. And we're going to say, no, you got to get back to today's rate. So then you have to sort of pay off some of the debt that you allow yourself to accumulate over time, but still not that massively different. Let me just skip ahead. Here's the real key, which is the full funding requires much, much larger adjustments. So if I wanted to be fully funded in 30 years at a 2.5% rate of return, I have to increase my contributions starting today, 36% of payroll. And if I wait 30 years, it's going to be 46% of payroll, the thing to the far right in that 2.5% column. If I assume the rate of return is 0, I have to increase my contributions by 60% today to be fully funded. That goes up over time because I'm saying you have to be fully funded. And so you've got to like just keep on making up more. And boy, getting to fully funded when you get no return on your assets is really hard, right? Because you put money in and it's not doing anything for you. It's not growing. You have to keep more and more and more and more. And so if you compare it, it's 7 versus 35. That's the difference about being fully funded in 30 years versus saying, let's just make sure debt is the same. Okay, so we have stuff in the paper. Did you send them the link to the paper? I actually don't have it on here. If anybody wants the paper, I'll give it to Chris and he can send it around to you guys if you want it. If you look and say, well, which plans have to do a lot and which plans have to do a little, because of this thing that we're doing about saying you just need to stabilize, the percent funding doesn't really have much of an impact on how much you have to do. So some of these plans like Illinois that we know are really poorly funded and New Jersey actually don't have to do much more. This is at 0. That's particularly true because assets are bad at 0. You might have thought, well, the poorly funded plans are putting nothing in. So of course they have to do the most, not because they're less funded, but because they put no contributions in. But that's not the case. Many of these plans actually have made really, really large changes. Like New Jersey got rid of their COLA. Illinois, new hires get very, very low benefits. So what we look at here is, this is the effect of plan changes and contribution increases since 2007 on what you would have to do to stabilize. So we're sort of comparing what you would have to do if you hadn't made those changes. And this is what you have to do now. And so the plans that don't have to do very much now can actually lower their contribution are the ones that have made these huge changes. Now, the thing that I don't show you here that we should be showing is that some of these plans like Illinois actually get rid of all their assets and they borrow. So in this world of ours, Illinois is going to say, look, I have a bunch of benefits to pay now, but in the future, I've got all this space because I don't have to pay much benefit. So I can use the money that I would have gone to pay benefits in the future to pay interest on debt. So they're like, let's borrow, get through this big period of expenses, and then we'll have plenty of money to pay the debt. So you might say, well, from a kind of perspective of pensions, that's not okay. And in the next version of the paper, we're going to show what this looks like if we say, no, they have to be at least as funded in the future as they have to be now. But we think this is a valid perspective. Okay, my quick takeaways. You can't equate less than full funding with sustainability, right? You do not have to be fully funded in order to be completely sustainable. At expected, not risk-adjusted rates of return, plans are not fully funded, but they are basically sustainable. I looked at 5% return, only 6 of our 40 plans ever exhaust their assets, and mostly not for a long time, except for New Jersey. At lower rates of return, plans are on average unsustainable, which means their debt is rising over time. At a 2.5% real rate of return, yes, they're unsustainable, but it's pretty moderate what they have to do. It's not a crisis. With a 0% rate of return, the adjustments are larger, but it's also true that at 0% return, you don't even want assets. And so you should wait in some sense, if that's what you believe. If you think rates of return are 0 are going to stay that way, you should wait. And then more broadly, this next slide isn't really about the paper, but the way I like to think about it and the way I want this to be just one of the considerations that a state and local government has, and just to think about it as debt, is that you really want to think about why we would want to lower implicit debt, right? So Pension funding is really about intergenerational equity. Why do we care about how well funded they are? The same reasons we care about whether or not the federal government has too much debt. We're worried about future taxpayers. Are we sticking taxpayers with this big bill? Are there going to be huge tax increases in the future because the pensions are not going to be able to pay their benefits and the states and local governments are going to have to raise taxes? So when you think about it that way, governments have a choice. How am I going to improve this the economic well-being of the next generation? They can use taxpayer monies to put the money in pensions. Say, well, one of the things I want to do is not leave them with this big bill on pensions. Or I can say, well, maybe if I put the money in education or climate resilience or improving the health, particularly of kids, I'm going to do better than that. And they should be thinking about that trade-off. If I'm trying to protect future taxpayers, I want to invest in whichever of these has the higher social rate of return, which is best for my future taxpayers. Because state and local governments have borrowing constraints, they can't just borrow to invest in education, but they can do it by not fully funding their pension. Not fully funding your pensions is a way of just borrowing to finance education. If I'm doing this big increase in education, to me, it seems like a perfect thing to borrow for. The benefits are in the future. It has huge benefits. And so I just think that I'm not saying you should always don't fund your pension, fund your education, but you should think about that. You should make that decision. And the other thing that it's not on this slide, but one of the things that I think has changed in economics a lot in the last 10 to 15 years is with the use of big data, we have a lot of very, very high quality evidence that things like investing in preschool, giving money to poor families, getting children health care actually has these huge rates of return, right? Wages are higher, educational attainment is higher, crime is lower, all the dimensions of society improve if you invest in kids and particularly in poor families. So our kind of larger thing is to say, when you're a state and local government deciding how much to put in your pension plan, think about what you're not doing when you do that and weigh those trade-offs. All right.
So we have time for a few questions. Ethan?
I can stop sharing.
Yeah,
Hi there.
Ethan,
My name is Ethan. I'm a reporter in New Hampshire. My internet isn't very good, so let me know if you can't hear me.
Great.
Okay, great. So we have lowered our projected rate of returns. We did an actuarial analysis that came out last year. We lowered it from 7.75% to 6.75%. And I've been asking about that. There've been about why that happened. One reason has been given is demographic changes, people aging, as you kind of mentioned. But another reason is just way lower than expected investment returns in the last 3 years. And that's something that's a little puzzling to me. They said that this is something that's happening across the country, but I thought up until the pandemic that, the 2 years before that were very good years for the stock market. And so I'm a little perplexed as to why it seems to not have been that way for pension plans. And that's sort of the reason that our state officials have been giving. Is that something that is seen nationally, and what is behind that?
Yeah, so I mean, you can have some very, very good years. The market has done pretty well, but it hasn't on average done as well over the past 10 years now or 12 years as plans have been assuming. So you can sort of look at history and, a 6% rate of return, 4% real it's pretty good still. And so so you had sort of some terrible years and then some great years. Now we've had a really, really great year. Surprisingly so. So that changed a little. I think more broadly, there's been a big recognition that when you look at many rates of return, they have been coming down over time, really since 1980. And so when we say treasuries have come down to zero, we kind of think it's not just about treasuries. It's about rates of return in general. And this demographic argument is going to be like, well, if you don't have a lot of new workers coming on because of demographics, then there's only so much new equipment you can give those workers. So like if you're saving a lot, then you're like giving these workers all this new equipment, it has sort of low productivity. There's a lot of reasons that people think rates of return have come down, but it's not just about government borrowing costs. It's really about the rate of return on capital. Productivity growth is low. That makes rates of return lower. But the thing is, we're economists are not really good at projecting these things. So these are projections. The market expects rates to remain really, really low, which means that they also expect the real return on stock market to be lower. So they all move together. All these rates are kind of going to move together. You might say, well, the stock market earns 4 or 5% more than treasuries. So when treasuries fall, the expected rate of return on the stock market falls as well. So plans have started to take that into account, but not a lot. So that they've moved only a little. But it's also true that like plans have been putting a lot of money into pensions, but given their expectations on their assets returns, they're not any better funded than they were 10 years ago. It's kind of puzzling, but it's because really rates of return have been pretty good, but not as good as they've been expecting.
Okay, so Stacy, and tell her where you're from.
Sure. So my name is Stacy Barchinger. I'm a reporter for the Bergen Record and the Gannett Papers in New Jersey. I am curious, is there a connection, and sorry, this is probably such a basic question, but is there a connection between pension fundedness and a state's credit rating? And if so, how much weight should policymakers be giving to the impact on the credit rating when they decide how much to put into the pension?
Right. So one of the things that we don't have in this sustainability analysis is this idea that maybe your rates, your borrowing costs on your debt could change as you put more money into pension. So that is a consideration. And it is. And again, and that's another thing is just let's look at the whole picture. Let's look at your real debt and let's look at your pension debt and let's look at the picture of the state as a whole instead of just focusing on the pension. That again is what we want to do. You know, we presented this paper 2 years ago and somebody was from Moody's was our discussant, and he said, yeah, we really care about funding and all this stuff. But then again, all these states have really good ratings, right? Almost all these states. So they recognize the sustainability, I think, this question that like, yeah, they have to make some small adjustments, but don't just look at this unfunded number and let it scare you. And frankly, they don't really take the 0% that seriously. That's more like the academic perspective, right? Because we're saying like, look, if they get reasonable rates of return, maybe 5 is a little high. Maybe we should have done it at 4. If they get 4% on average over time, yeah, they'll have some bad years and they'll have some good years, but they will be okay in the long run. If you take it from a purely pension perspective, you're like, oh, but they might run out of assets. That would be disastrous. If you think broader, like, yeah, they could run out of assets, but the state could like then just like supplement and borrow, or and so there's a lot more latitude. And they could raise taxes if they have to. It's not like, oh, we go bankrupt. The state has huge taxing capacity, and that changes how you think about it too. But yeah, that is definitely consideration, and ratings agencies definitely look at it. Let me say one last thing is ratings agencies claim they will also like do those calculations to say, well, you didn't put money in your pension, but you did fund education. And so we think you're a better prospect in the future. I don't know how much they actually do that. They claim they do. And because that is really the right thing. And actually there's like evidence that says when you raise money, when you raise investment in education, like your house prices go up. So you can kind of see it almost automatically in terms of your revenue streams. And so maybe they do take that into account.